האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, good evening, Dobra V'Yetcher. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Pikudei. We're going to do Os Zion, section 7. Before we begin, we're going to take a look at a few psukim from Parshas Kisisa. So we're going back a little bit in the Torah, and we'll talk about why in a moment. And then we'll look at a few psukim from our parsha, Parshas Pikudei. You'll see both little sets of psukim talk about the same subject matter. So here we go. This is Parshas Kisisa, Perek Lamed, Psukim Yud Zayin through Chaf Aleph. Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. And Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, Ve'osisa kiyor nechoshes. And you should make a copper basin, v'chano nechoshes, and a copper base, l'rochtzah, for washing. V'nosata oso bein ohel moed uvein hamizbeach, and you should place it between the Ohel Moed and between the Mizbeach, the Nasata Shama Mayim, and you should place there water. You should put water in this washing basin. Verochatzu Aharon uvonav mimenu, and Aaron and his sons should wash from it. Es yedehem v'es raglehem, their hands and their feet. Bevoam el Ohel Moed, when they come into the Ohel Moed, yirchatzu mayim v'lo yamusu. They should wash with the water and not die. Or when they approach the Mizbeach to serve, to burn an offering to Hashem. So whether or not the Kohanim are coming in to bring offerings on the Mizbeach, the outer Mizbeach, or they're actually entering the Ohel Moed, and either one of those two scenarios, they had to wash their hands and their feet. V'rochatzu yedehem v'raglehem v'lo yamusu, and they will wash their hands and their feet and not die. V'hoyasolahem chok olam, and this will be for them an eternal statute, lo, to him, meaning to Aharon, ulezaro, and to his offspring, lidorosam, for their generation. So this little section here is called Parshas HaKiyor. It's the section in the Torah where the commandment is given, the tzivoy, the mitzvos are given, the mitzvah is given for Moshe to make a special washing basin that stood on a base, that sat on a base, and where he should place it, and that Aharon, the Kohanim, Aaron and his sons should wash their hands and feet from this kiyor, from this basin. That's Parshas Kisisa. Now, we're going to move to our parsha, Parshas Pikudei, and we're going to look at Perek Mem, Psukim Lamed through Lamed Beis. Vayosem es hakiyor bein Ohel Moed uvein hamizbeach, and he, referring to Moshe Rabbeinu, placed the kiyor between the Ohel Moed and between the Mizbeach, Vayitein Shama Mayim Lirochza, and he put water in it for washing. V'rochatzu mimenu Moshe ve'Aharon uvonav, and Moshe and Aharon and his sons washed from it, es yedehem v'es raglehem, their hands and their feet. Bevoam el Ohel Moed, when they came into the Ohel Moed, uvekarva v'asam el hamizbeach yirchatzu. And when they approached the Mizbeach, they would wash, ka'asher tziva Hashem es Moshe, like that which Hashem had commanded to Moshe. So there are some differences between this discussion of the kiyor and the previous one in Parshas Kisisa, but that's not what we're going to focus on right now. For our purposes right now, we're just going to make the point that back in Parshas Kisisa, Hashem was giving the command to Moshe about making the kiyor, the basin, and where to put it and what it would be used for. And then in our parsha of Pikudei, the Torah is actually relating that Moshe made it and put it where it was supposed to be, and it was used in that location where it was placed between the outer Mizbeach and the Ohel Moed. Okay, now let's get into the text of the Zera Shimshon. V'rochatzu mimenu Moshe v'Aharon uvonav. And Moshe and Aaron and his sons washed their hands and their feet from the kiyor, from this washing station. That right there is the pasuk from our parsha and Parshas Pikudei. Gemara, in the Gemara, lefi girsas Rashi, according to the text of Rashi, and we'll see there's going to be a different way of learning this Gemara, but in the Gemara, this is Maseches Zvachim that's being quoted. According to the text of Rashi, Lemeda mimenu, we learn from this pasuk, shekol kiyor she'ein bo lekadesh arba'a kohanim mimenu. Every basin that might be made, which doesn't hold enough water for 4 kohanim to wash their hands and feet, ein mikadshin bo. You do not do the sanctification, which is a way of referring to the washing ceremony with that kiyor. So a kiyor, a basin that doesn't hold enough water for 4 kohanim to wash their hands and feet, is puzzle. It's invalid. It can't be used. Sheperasham, because the Gemara explains, Rashi explains over there, Moshe ve'Aharon train. When the Torah says Moshe and Aaron will wash their hands, that's 2 people. Uvanov, and then it says, and his sons, terrain, that's another 2 people. Demiut rabim shnayim, because the least amount of people included when the Torah uses a plural word is 2. So when the Torah says Uvanov and his sons, it doesn't specify how many of Aaron's 4 sons are being talked about, but the minimum of the word indicated by the word Uvanov and his sons plural is 2. So you have to have at least 2. So Rashi says the pasuk in our parsha of Pikudei tells us that the kiyor, the basin, was going to be used by at least 4 people: Aharon, Moshe, and 2 of Aharon's sons. So that's a total of 4, and therefore the Gemara learned out that when a kiyor, when a basin for the Mishkan was made, or for the Beis HaMikdash, it had to hold at least enough water for 4 people. De'im lochein, because if that's not so, meaning if that's not what the Torah was trying to say, hoyololomar v'chol banav, then the Torah should have said Moshe and Aaron and all of Aaron's sons. If the Torah wanted to talk about all 4 of Aaron's sons, and therefore the kiyor would have had to have enough water for 6 people, Moshe, Aaron, and Aaron's 4 sons, it should have said v'chol banav, and all of Aaron's sons, or it could have said and his 4 sons, but it didn't. It said Moshe and Aaron and Avanav and Aaron's sons, and so we don't know how many sons, and we know the minimum is 2. So Rashi says that's how the Gemara learns out that the kiyor had to hold enough water for at least 4 people to wash their hands and their feet. Now we're going to see that the source for this law is complicated and a subject of a machlokas between Rashi, whose opinion we just learned, and the Rambam, whose opinion is coming up. But I just want to be clear. I want us to all to keep in mind the idea that the kiyor, the basin, had to hold enough water for 4 people. Let's consider that a fact. That's just a fact. The question that we're going to be discussing and see our 2 opinions about, and then explanations of those opinions and questions on those opinions, are what is the source in the Torah? Where did the Gemara learn out this halacha, this law, that the basin had to hold water for a minimum of 4 people? So in this first paragraph, we learned Rashi's opinion, that it comes right here from our parsha of Pikudei, where it says, Moshe v'Aaron uvanav. Moshe and Aaron and his sons. Moshe and Aaron is 2, and his sons is a minimum of 2, so it gives you 4 people. Next paragraph. V'hiksha b'sefer tzon kadoshim. Zera Shimshon brings down a question that's asked in a different sefer called tzon kadoshim. The mikra zeh kosav ba'asiyas hakiyor b'parshas Pikudei. The sefer tzon kadoshim asks, this pasuk that Rashi uses as the source to learn out the law about a kiyor having to hold enough for 4 people. This pasuk is written when it's talking about the actual making of the kiyor in Parshas Pikudei, our parsha. V'lama lo rama zeh Hashem yisbarach leMoshe. Why didn't Hashem hint this halacha to Moshe b'tzivoy hakiyor, when he gave the commandment to make the kiyor, b'parshas kisisa, back in parshas kisisa. This is a very strong question, so let's pause to make sure we understand it. We mentioned in the beginning, we looked at psukim previously in the Torah from parshas kisisa about the making of the kiyor and the placement of the kiyor and the function of the kiyor, the basin. And we also looked at psukim in our parsha and Pikudei, and we pointed out that the psukim back in kisisa are not talking about when Moshe actually made the kiyor and set it up. It's talking about the mitzvah that Hashem gave Moshe along with the commandments to build all the other parts of the Mishkan. It was talking about, this is what you should do, Moshe. So the Tzon Kedoshim asks, Hashem, we would think, needed to at the very least, hint to Moshe, instruct Moshe or hint to Moshe when he gave the mitzvah of making the kiyor, this idea that it had to be big enough to hold the water for 4 people to wash their hands and their feet. Because if Hashem did not at the very least hint that requirement, how would Moshe know it? How would Moshe know that that was the thing he needed to do? So the Tzon Kedoshim asks, according to Rashi, whose opinion we just read in the previous paragraph, the Torah did not teach that law about the kiyor needing to be big enough to hold the water to hold enough water for 4 people back when Hashem gave the mitzvah to make the kiyor. Rather, here, when it's talking about Moshe actually making it and setting it up where it's supposed to be, that's where Rashi says Hashem taught the law. It would seem too late. That's too late in the game for Hashem to teach that halacha. Why didn't Hashem at least hint to it in the pasuk in Parshas Kisisa previously? Let's continue. Ve'harambam b'perek hey mehilchos piyas hamikdash. The Rambam, Maimonides, in the 5th chapter of his laws about the Beis HaMikdash, Lomad Zeh Hadin, he learns this halacha about the kiyor having to hold enough water for 4 people, Mea Pasuk Shel Kisisa, from the Pasuk back in Parshas Kisisa, V'rochatzu Aharon uvonav mimenu. The Pasuk says, Aaron and his sons will wash from it. Ufinchos haya imohem, and Finchos, Aaron's grandson, was with them. Hare arba, that's 4 people. Now let's pause here, because part of what we just learned is going to make a lot of sense to us, and part of this is going to be very difficult. And as the Zera Shimshon continues, he'll get into those difficulties. But let's just understand what was just taught to us. So the Zera Shimshon brings in another sefer called Tzon Kedoshim. And the Tzon Kedoshim asks that strong question on Rashi. Rashi, why are you saying that the Torah is teaching the law about how much water the kiyor has to hold now in Parshas Pikudei? The Torah should have taught it back in Parshas Kisisa, when the mitzvah was given to make the kiyor. That's how you would need to know the specification about how much water it needs to hold. Then the Tzon Kedoshim says, and the Rambam clearly holds according to the thought process behind my question, because the Rambam says that in fact it is the pasuk in Kisisa where it says V'rochatzu Aharon uvonav mimenu. Aaron and his sons will wash from this basin. That's where the law about 4 people washing from the basin, that's where the law about the amount of water that is a minimum for it to hold is learned from. So it's beautiful. It makes perfect sense. However, when we do a number count, we see there's a problem. Aaron, of course, is 1. Aaron had 4 sons. So Aaron and his sons, if you're counting all his sons, gets you already to 5. And then Rambam says Pinchas was with them. If Pinchas was with them, you're up to 6 people. And we don't say the kiyor has to hold enough water for 6 people. We say it has to hold enough water for 4 people. Well, where does 4 come from? So you might say, going back to a point we made in the first paragraph, that sons doesn't specify a number, and the minimum amount of a plural is 2. So you might say Aharon is 2, and his sons, I'm sorry, excuse me, Aaron is 1, of course, and his sons is 2. That gives you 3. And then if you add Pinchas to the group, then you would in fact get to 4. So the Tzon Kedoshim, the Sefer Tzon Kedoshim, that commentator, learns the Rambam to believe that the pasuk back in Parshas Pikudei, V'rochatzu Aaron uvanav mimenu, is referring not to Aaron's 4 sons, but to 2 of Aaron's sons with Aaron, which would give you 3. And then the Rambam says, well, Pinchas was also there, and he needed to wash his hands and his feet from the kior. So that's 4 people, and that's where the Gemara's drasha comes from. That's where the Gemara's halacha comes from, that the kior has to hold enough water for 4 people. So right now at this moment, we have an argument between Rashi and the Rambam about the source for the law in the Gemara that the base and the kior in the Mishkan had to hold at a minimum enough water for 4 people. Rashi learns it from our parsha here in Pikudei when it talks about the kior, and Rambam learns it from back in Parshas Kisisa when it talks about the kior. And as we go further, we'll see that that there are questions that need to be explained about both of these opinions. Next paragraph. V'hakesef Mishnah docha gersa zo. The Kesef Mishnah, which is a very famous commentary on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, written by Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, he rejects the text that the Rambam brings. Umasik kegirsas Rashi. And the Kesef Mishnah concludes that the correct text in the Gemara follows Rashi's statement, which was given back in paragraph 1, which means that the law about the amount of water that the kior has to hold comes from our parsha, Parshas Pikudei, and not from the psukim in Parshas Kisisa. V'gam harav hanizkar le'el, and also the rabbi, the commentator that was mentioned previously, meaning the Tzon Kedoshim, also he, hikshe, top of the next column, b'shem habirchas hazovach. He asked a question in the name of another rabbi, another commentator, the Birkas Hazevach. Al Peruz Zeh Shel HaRambam, another question on the Rambam. De'ech matzinu lemelaf mi uvonov. How can we possibly learn from the words and his sons, sheyiyu arba'a, that there will be 4, v'sheyiyeh Pinchas imohem, and that Pinchas should be included among them? In other words, how did the Rambam possibly get to the number 4 from a pasuk that talked about Aaron and his sons, and Pinchas was not one of the sons of Aaron? V'hinicho b'tzorach iyun, and this commentator Birchas Zevach leaves the matter with says it's a matter that requires further investigation. V'ayin sham, and you can look there to see more about this discussion. But the point is, there's a real problem with the Rambam's way of learning, because the pasuk says Aaron and his sons. So if you think in his sons means his 4 sons, that gives you the number 5. If you think it means the minimum of sons, which is 2, and it just means 2 of his sons, not all 4 of his sons, that gives you 3. So you'd be okay from those psukim back in Kisisa saying the kior has to hold enough for 3 people or for 5 people. But there's no way to see an easy way to say that number 4 is what's being talked about. And by the Rambam bringing in Pinchas, that makes things even stranger, because the pasuk clearly says Aaron and his sons, and Pinchas was not a son of Aaron. Pinchas was a grandson of Aaron. So how in the world can you use that pasuk to learn that you need enough water for 4 people, when either the pasuk is referring to 3 or 5, but definitely not 4? So that's the big question on the Rambam's viewpoint. V'od yesh lahakshos al perusho shel harambam. Next paragraph. And there's another question we can ask on the explanation of the Rambam. De'echa ya Pinchas imohem. How could you include Pinchas with Aaron and his sons at all. How could you even think? Forget about the problem that Pinchas is not a son of Aaron. But how could you include him at all? The halo, is it not true? Lo niskahen Pinchas. Pinchas did not even become a Kohen. Ad sheharago lezimri, until he killed Zimri. We'll talk about that incident in a moment. Uchesheharag Zimri, and when Pinchas killed Zimri, Kvar Meis Aharon. Aharon had already died. The Nimtza, and so we find Shel Olam, in all situations, like no matter what we say, Lo Kidshu Arboa Bevas Achas. There is no scenario in which 4 people were washing their hands and feet at the same time from the kior. Ella Aaron Ushnei Vonav. You could say Aaron and 2 of his sons washed their hands. That would give you 3. O Shlosha Bonav Levadam. Or you might say 3 sons in quotation marks washed by themselves. Dahainu Elazar v'Isamar u'Phinchas, which would include the 2 sons, the 2 youngest sons, Elazar and Isamar and Pinchas. O Aharon v'Arba'as Bonav, or Aharon and all 4 of his sons, which would give you 5. So either you have Aaron and 2 sons for 3, or Aaron and all 4 sons for 5, or if you want to include Pinchas, which is a stretch, you can include him, but then you're including him with Aaron's 2 sons, and you're still only at 3. You're not at 4. So this is a very important point. The Zera Shimshon is saying that to include Pinchas in the count of people who would use the kior, the washing station at this time, is a very strange and almost impossible thing to say, because Pinchas, we assume, did not become a Kohen until he killed Zimri. That's a reference to an episode at the end of Parshas Korach, in the beginning of Parshas Pinchas, where we see, the end of Parshas Bolak and the beginning of Parshas Pinchas, where we see that Zimri ben Salu, who was one of the leaders of the tribe of Shimon, brought a non-Jewish woman to have relations with her, and Pinchas became enraged over this violation of halacha, and he killed Zimri and the woman. And when he killed Zimri and the woman, the Torah tells us that Hashem gave him a special reward of a bris kehunas olam, a covenant of the kahuna eternally. And the way that that's generally understood is that because Pinchas was alive when Hashem told Aaron that he and his sons would be the first Kohanim, so he wasn't included in that. He wasn't, as we said, he wasn't a son of Aaron at that time or any time in the future. He was a grandson of Aaron. So therefore, he didn't become a Kohen. That's our assumption. However, later on, when he did this heroic act, which brought an end to a plague that was killing members of Bnei Yisrael, that's when he became, as a special recognition from Hashem, that's when he became a Kohen. So at the time, the problem is, at the time, when the pasuk talks about Aaron and his sons washing their hands from the kior, you can't include Pinchas because Pinchas wasn't even a Kohen at that time. So what would be the point of saying that Pinchas would be washing his hands from the kior? He wasn't even a Kohen. He wasn't included in the entire, and any of the mitzvos that had to do with the Kohanim at that time. Only later on did he become a Kohen based on his actions and the killing of Zimri and Cosbi Bas Tzur. So that's what the Zera Shimshon is saying. We're going to see that there's some flexibility there, but that's what he's saying now. Next paragraph. In order to answer this question on the Rambam, we can say that the Perak Yud Beis Dizvachim in the 12th chapter of Maseches Zvachim is, so the Gemara states, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Shimon Omrim. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, 2 of the great Tanoim, the great sages of the time of the Mishnah, said, Mipnei Tuma Nisrafa. Because of impurity, it was burned. What was burned? We'll talk about it in a moment. She'im ata omer mipnei aninus nisrufa, if you say it was burned because of the laws of aninus, of the first day of mourning after a person loses one of the close relatives, v'halo Pinchas haya imahem shelo haya onein. But Pinchas was with them, and he wasn't a close relative enough to be considered an onein. So let's pause before we continue. What's being referred to here is a very famous incident. The Torah tells us that on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the day in which the Mishkan was set up, the original time when it was inaugurated and set up. Now, before that day, for the 7 previous days, Moshe had set it up and taken it down. But when it was finally set up to stand and to be used after that, moving forward, on that Rosh Chodesh, a korban chatos, a sin offering, was brought, and it was not eaten. Normally, a korban chatos would be eaten by the Kohanim, and it wasn't eaten. The parts that were supposed to be eaten were not eaten by any of the Kohanim, and Moshe became very upset about that. So in the Gemara, there's a discussion between these Tanoim. Why wasn't it eaten? Why wasn't this korban chatos consumed like a korban chatos, like that particular korban chatos should have been? Why weren't the parts of the sacrifice that should have been eaten by the Kohanim eaten? So that turns out to be the subject of an argument between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon on the one hand, and Rabbi Nechemia on the other hand. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon say, Mipnei Tuma Nisrafa. The sacrifice had become impure, and a korban that becomes impure should be burnt. And so that's why it was burnt and not consumed. Inadvertently, it was made impure, it became impure, and that's why it had to be burnt, and that's why it couldn't be eaten. That's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon's explanation as to why this particular korban chatos, the parts of it that were supposed to be eaten, were not eaten. Rabbi Nechemia says that the reason it wasn't eaten was because of aninus, because this day was the day when 2 of Aaron's sons died. We know the story where they brought an Eish Zara, a strange fire, into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and they were struck down. They died at that moment. And because they died, it turned Aharon, their father, and their 2 brothers into, gave them the status of aninos, of each one becoming an onain. And an onain is not allowed to eat sacrificial meat, is not allowed to eat from the korbanos. So Rabbi Nechemia says that's the reason that the sacrifice wasn't eaten. It's because Aaron and his sons couldn't eat it. They were in a state of aninus, meaning that they had lost these close relatives, the brothers on the one hand, or the sons on the other hand, to Aaron, it had just happened, and so they were in the status of aninus. Aninus lasts until the bodies are buried, until the kvura, until the burial. And Rabbi Nechemia says that's why they couldn't eat the parts of the sacrifice that would normally have been consumed. So let's go back for a moment to see that inside. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon omrim. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon say, Mipnei Tuma Nisrafa. The sacrifice was burnt and not consumed because it became impure accidentally. She'im ata omer Mipnei Aninos Nisrafa. If you say the other opinion, namely Rabbi Nechemia's opinion, that it got burnt because of Aninos, because of the stage of mourning when these mourners, namely Aaron's sons and his father, couldn't eat from the meat of a korban. If that's your reasoning, v'halo Pinchas hayimahem. Pinchas was with them, shelo haya onein, and he wasn't an onein because he was not a direct close relative of the 2 men who died. He was a nephew of the men who died, and a nephew is not considered one of the close relatives who becomes an onein at the point when a person dies. For Rabbi Nechemia Svirale, Rabbi Nechemia is of the opinion, next column on the right, Shelonis Kahin Pinchas ad sheharogo lezimri. Pinchas did not become a Kohen until he killed Zimri, meaning he wasn't a Kohen at the time when the korban needed to be eaten, and so he wasn't available to eat it. And the other Kohanim, Aaron and his sons, who could have eaten it, were all in the state of aninos, and therefore they couldn't eat it. And that's why Rabbi Nechemya says it did not get eaten. The Efsher sheharambam sfir lekidei azo. And perhaps the Rambam holds like the opinion we're seeing in this Gemara, namely the opinion of the other two Tanoim, not Rabbi Nechemya, but Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, who hold that Pinchas was already a Kohen from the very beginning. It's not, in other words, this view is that Pinchas did not suddenly become a Kohen after his heroic act of killing Zimri and the non-Jewish woman he was cohabitating with. That's not the Rambam's view. The Rambam's view follows these two Tanoim, these two sages of the Mishnah, who clearly felt that Pinchas was already a Kohen much earlier, way before the episode in which he killed Zimri and his paramour. So therefore, the Rambam can be explained that way as being based on that opinion that Pinchas was already a Kohen earlier on and did not become a Kohen only later. Next paragraph. V'od Yisasham Perak Yudalad Daf Kuf Tezvav. It's also stated in the Gemara in Zevachim in the 14th chapter. V'no'adati shama livnei Yisrael. This is a pasuk in Shmos, as you can see in the parentheses. And I will make myself known there, meaning in the Mishkan, to Bnei Yisrael, v'nikdash bichvodi, and I will be sanctified through my honor. Al tikre bichvodi. So Chazal say, don't read this pasuk that Hashem is saying, I will be sanctified through my honor, ela b'mechubadai, but rather I will be sanctified through those that honor me. Dovar zeh amaru HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Moshe mitchila. Hashem said this statement to Moshe all the way back in the beginning. Before Aaron's two sons died, Hashem had already hinted to it in this pasuk. V'lo yida'o ad shemesu bonav shel Aaron. And Moshe didn't understand or wasn't aware specifically of who would die until the sons of Aaron died. V'chule, etc. V'ayin sham, and see over there. Tishmamino, we learn from this, shemitchila nigzar aleihem, from the very beginning, it was decreed on them, on Aaron's two oldest sons, that they would die at this inauguration of the Mishkan. Uchad de'isa b'medrash, as it states in the Medrash, shemisinai notlu ipopusin shelahem lemisa. All the way back at the time of Har Sinai, Aaron's two oldest sons were given their death penalties. Dichsiv, as it's written in the Torah, this is in Parshas Mishpatim, ve'elatzile b'nei Yisrael v'chule. It says that regarding the receiving of the Torah in Har Sinai, it says to the mighty ones of b'nei Yisrael, Hashem did not stretch out his hand, meaning at that time, Aaron's two sons, and perhaps other people, Aaron's oldest two sons, and perhaps others, received the death penalty, but it wasn't carried out then. They did something very wrong at that time, at the time of Ma'amad Har Sinai. And however, the pasuk says that Hashem did not stretch out his hand to punish them then. And in the case of Aaron's two sons, the punishment was held until the episode that we talked about, where they brought the Eish Zora, the strange fire, to the Mishkan, and that's when the verdict was carried out, and they were killed. And if so, according to the Rambam, we can say, Shehakosov Omar Uvonov Stam. The pasuk says, and his sons, Aaron and his sons, Stam, without any elaboration. The Mashma Kol Habonim Shir Chatzuim Aaron. That implies it's talking about all the sons who would wash their hands and feet with Aaron. V'yesh b'chlal zeh gam kein Pinchas. And you can include Pinchas with this. Shebnei bonim harehem kibonim, because the Gemara teaches us that grandchildren are considered like children. Grandchildren can be referred to as children. the ein svara lomar she'uvonov koilel gam noda ve'avihu, and you can't think that when it says Aaron and his sons, that would include the two oldest sons, Nadav and Avihu, even though they were alive at that moment. You can't say it includes them. Shaharei HaKosov Omer v'hoyus olahem chak olam lo lizara, because the pasuk says that washing of the hands will be given as an eternal statute to him and his children, his offspring. The afshar, and it's impossible shehakosov yidaber zel Nadav ve'avihu, that the pasuk would refer to each one of those sons with his children about Nadav and Avihu, who were childless, who were not married at the time. Shekvar gozer alehem misa. They were not married. They didn't have children at that time, and chi of misa was issued against them, unbeknownst to them. Kishamar leMoshe v'nikdashti b'chavodi. When Hashem said to Moshe, "I will be sanctified through my honor," and Chazal say we can learn it to mean I will be sanctified through those that honor me, through the death of those that honor me, which brought a Kiddush Hashem. It brought an important teaching to Bnei Yisrael, and that was referring to the death of Aaron's two oldest sons. So that is something that's taken for granted when we learn the psukim, the previous psukim. V'in hachinami, and we need to concede shemitchila lo hayolanu limud boror mizeh pasuk. It's true that we cannot learn to begin with a clear teaching from this pasuk that you need water for 4 people. Sheyiu tzrichim arba kohanim dafka, that you specifically need enough water for 4 kohanim. Ela mea pasuk shel parsha zo. But rather you learn it from the pasuk in our parsha of Pikudei v'rochatzu mimenu Moshe v'Aaron u'bono. Moshe and Aaron and his sons will wash their hands from it. Omnam, however, la'achar shemesu Nadav Avihu, after Nadav and Avihu died, meaning after the Torah tells us about the death of Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's 2 oldest sons, Nodelanu, then it is known to us lamafreya retroactively, shegam betzivoy hakiyur, that also the creating of the kiyor, kacha yisok kavanas hakosu, so was the intention of the pasuk, meaning when it said uvonav, it didn't mean all 4 sons of Aaron, it only meant 2. And if you're talking about Moshe and Aaron and 2 of his sons washing their hands from the kiyor, then you can learn the halacha about 4 people needing to be able to wash their hands and feet from the mizbeach. So that is the explanation of Rashi's viewpoint all the way back in the first paragraph. Uvein divrei Rambam, uvein divrei Rashi, hem divrei Elokim Chaim. Whether or not you take the words of Rambam or the words of Rashi, they are the words of the living God, meaning they're both accurate and they're both correct, even though they're saying, saying that the source of this law about the water for 4 people comes from different psukim. We can say that both statements are correct. Rashi nokat pasuk zeh. Rashi nokat pasuk shel parsha zo. Rashi uses a pasuk in our parsha of Pikudei, meaning the later pasuk, lefi shehu limud yoser pashut, because it's a learning that is simpler. It's simpler to look at the words in the pasuk here in Parshas Pikudei and say it's talking about 4 people. The ode, and another thing, mishum de ozil l'shitase, because he goes according to his own viewpoint. The Parshas Pinchas perish command Omar lo niskaven Pinchas ad sheharog lo niskahen Pinchas ad sheharogo lezimri. Rashi holds that Pinchas was not a Kohen until he killed Zimri. So Rashi doesn't have the luxury of using the pasuk in Parshas Kisisa like Rambam does and saying it's referring to Pinchas, because at that time, according to Rashi, Pinchas was not a Kohen. He only became a Kohen later on. V'harambam nakad pasuk shel Kisisa. The Rambam uses the pasuk back in Kisisa, ki hechi delo tikshu kusha hanizkar la'el, in order that we shouldn't ask the question that was asked previously. The original question that was asked back towards the beginning of the piece was, why would the Torah use the pasuk here in Parshas Pikudei and not use the pasuk earlier on in Parshas Kisisa. So the Rambam therefore said, that's a really good question. Let's see if we can learn out what we need to learn out from the psukim in Parshas Kisisa. And that's in fact what the Rambam did. In order that you don't have the question before, why wasn't this law hinted to at the very least in the original commandment to make the kior back in Parshas Kisisa? And the Rambam made known to us with this, the Rambam is making it known to us that even from this pasuk, it's good, it's a correct drush, it's a correct learning of the hint about the water for 4 people from the pasuk in Kisisa, which refers to Aharon's sons, Aaron and his sons, and Pinchas. So you have Aharon, and you have his 2 sons, and you have Pinchas, and that gives you the magic number of 4. So what we've seen in the Zera Shimshon is that everyone agrees to the halacha, that the kior needs to hold enough water for a minimum of 4 people to wash their hands and their feet. That we've got, that we agree to. That's a fact. Put it in the books. The machlokas between Rashi and Rambam is what is the source for that law. And the Zera Shimshon was able to show us the different questions and problems on Rashi and on Rambam's viewpoints, and then using different sources, different makoros to answer those questions to help us understand everything in a deeper and more accurate manner. Yasher koach for learning together in the Zera Shimshon this week, and we look forward, God willing, to learning together again in the Zera Shimshon on next week's parsha.